Hi, how you doing? I'm Kevin McTeague. I'm a professor of marketing and advertising up at Kellogg, Northwestern's business school. Um, Dave asked me to moderate this. It feels like 6 years ago, but it was probably not that long ago. And I said, absolutely. I'm really excited about this space, right? My background includes a little bit as an account guy, a little bit as a client guy. Um, and so this idea that we can kind of bridge these two worlds of taking the wonderful specificity and targeting capabilities of digital and bringing that to life in an impactful way on the big screen seems like a great idea, right? So I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here, and I'm excited to learn from our panelists. So we'll get started by just having our panelists introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get on to some questions. Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. Matthew Kramer, I'm the Managing Director of Advanced TV at Omnicom Media Group.
Great. I'm Jeff Boehme. I head up TV and cross-platform research at Comscore.
And I'm Dylan Moorhead, and I lead programmatic product solutions for Roku.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. So what I wanted to do to start us off was, if you've read anything about this, it gets super confusing super fast, okay? Or maybe it's just me, but for me, it gets super confusing super fast. So can I have you start by just setting the table and giving us kind of the baseline? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about advanced TV?
Sure. So advanced TV. So this is the way I like to kind of talk to Omnicom, both internal and external. There's sort of 3 buckets of advanced TV today. And all of these buckets are being powered by the new data and the technology that exists today that didn't exist a few years ago. So if you think about it, there's a bunch of data sets out there that were kind of born in the digital space that are now becoming applicable to the television world, right? So just going through those 3 buckets, you have what we call data-driven linear. You might have heard the term programmatic television. That's not really a thing if it's linear TV, right? But this idea of data-driven linear is basically applying those first and third-party data sets to something beyond the Nielsen panel for TV viewership, like smart TV data or STB data, which is set-top box data from the cable providers, right? Basically building indices at the network, day part, and program level, and basically optimizing your TV schedules against first and third-party data. Knowing that you're buying a unit, you're still buying a spot on TV, which means that you inherently still have out-of-target delivery, right? But you're getting the composition of your intended target, not just GRP's broad demography from Nielsen. You're increasing that composition of each spot. So that's the first one.
So that's first one is same TV like we always bought it, but with way better targeting because we have the third-party data layers.
Better targeting, still one-to-many.
Yep.
Right? The next bucket would be household addressable. This is where you're buying at a household level through the local cable providers, so Comcast, Dish, AT&T/Xandr. And what you're doing here is you're basically using that first and third-party data, maybe what you already use for your general campaign, your national campaign, and you're basically trying to heavy up within those households that match against that first or third-party data, right? So you're eliminating a lot of the waste by essentially only targeting those homes that match against that target. So that's one-to-household delivery, right? And then the third bucket is what we're calling IPTV, which is Internet Protocol Television. That's made up of 2 sources, right? The first source would be the access point or the CTV device itself. Roku's in the room. The Roku stick is a very popular way of people getting that access to that content. And then the other part of it is OTT apps, right? So you can think of it as Roku, the CTV device being the hardware, right? And then you have the software, which would be the apps or the OTT apps that you're plugging into. So this is the actual content that you're trying to watch, right? While this is the hardware that's plugging you and giving you that access. This is a different space because now you're getting closer to that one-to-device or you could say one to individual, right? Obviously, the largest screen is sometimes shared, so we have to keep that in mind. But certainly now you're getting into the point where audience-based buying is getting a little bit more true here, right? We still have some ways to go in terms of mapping device IDs to audiences, but you have the infrastructure to be able to do that, and you can buy this space programmatically. The first two you can't really do that with.
Okay. So
Clear? Good?
wait, so I'm going way back. First one, regular buying, smarter. Second one, we're going through the provider, Xfinity, Dish.
Yep.
Can't buy that programmatically.
Not really,
Not
no.
really. And then the third one's like basically OTT, and you can buy it.
Right.
Like a Roku. Third one's basically like a Roku, and you can buy that programmatically.
Correct. Yep.
Great.
Did I get through that right?
So
All right, good.
Very
is
good.
that it builds on that?
Very good. Yeah, so
Is that
Bill,
roughly right?
we concur?
I mean, I guess I would just add, so what, and it isn't specific to Roku, just in general, connected TV is built on open RTB protocol, meaning that it transacts the exact same way as a desktop or mobile device. There are just different data points which are being used. I'm sure most of us in the room might be familiar with the fact that there aren't any cookies on connected TV. And so we're using different data points to enable that transaction, which is comparable to the way desktop and mobile would be transacted programmatically.
It's very simple.
Please.
Sorry.
And I agree with everything that Matt was saying. So from the research point of view, what we try to do is to describe it as simply as you can, and imagine talking to your mom, your dad, or your kids and say, well, what do you do all day? And the problem is then we're faced with the reality of what you just described. So on a simplistic way, technology is changing the way that we are behaving in terms of media and everything else. The data that comes back from that is really important because that's telling us more about the behavior in measurable ways. The problem is always, and has always been, because I've been in the business a while in local TV, network TV, cable television, and then got into the measurement business, because how easy could it be to measure this stuff? It's hard. It's hard. The problem now is the technology is expanding quickly. And in 3 years from now, we'll be looking at an entire different landscape, which means that everybody's jobs here is going to change, and data becoming more prevalent now. But be careful, because privacy rights, GDPR, all of these things now are going to impact everything that's going on. So I would agree that from a high level, those three areas are where we are today. The question is going to be, what happens now? And more importantly, how are marketers going to stay on top of this? So is anybody in the research field? And can I ask where you are? Lucid. And what do you do there, sir? It pays a little better, doesn't it? It does. The reason why I'm saying that is that we have, because of the technology and data, now we have the world of the data scientists. The data scientist has almost eclipsed the media researcher. Now we're seeing it come back, and now we're having a yin yang, which is really what we need. So it's more complicated than ever before. The bad news is that it's going to get even more complicated and change. The good news is that this works, and everything that you've described, if you can measure it well and understand what now you want to measure, that's going to be successful. Moving from age, gender into consumer metrics, because we can, will evolve this industry like you've never seen before.
If we think about, let's take 2 and 3, right? So I can buy directly over basically I want to target a household level.
Yep.
I've seen stats that say this is 3% of available households. I've seen stats that say it's half of households. How big is it?
Well, again, it depends on how you want to define it based on the technology.
Okay.
So if you think about the households now, and the rough estimate that I would concur with is about 50% of homes now are addressable. But then you have to think about, well, what does that really mean? Because addressable can mean that a message goes to the home. But then the question is, well, how does it get into the home? So full transparency, I was with the Nielsen Company, Cantor Media, Brent Track, and now Comscore, all through a succession of various acquisitions. But it's a linear progression or regression, as we say, to the mean, which gives us at about 0.98, so it works real well. The point I'm trying to make is that as we look at that growth pattern, and to answer your question, DirecTV in 2010 was sending ads directly to the set-top box in the home. So the reason why I know is when I got to Kantar, I had to develop plans and sequences on how we try to measure those things, because that is an almost deterministic type of application where it gets right to the box in the home and can go to multiple boxes, meaning that if you're in cars, you can send one house one ad and the other house another ad, all in the same platform, but they at the time had 12 million homes.
Okay.
Is Dish the same way? Is it the same way with Roku? Is it the same way everywhere that way? Kind of, sort of. So what we do at Comscore, we measure addressable. So we've been the first in the business. We are managing and reporting on a lot of those activities, but they're different. And the challenge for us is, how do we create similar metrics, comparable metrics, so that an advertiser, an agency can understand what those value systems are, so that we're speaking about the same thing. And if you're not involved in the conversations about those definitions, please do so, because it really becomes important on defining success.
Great. So if roughly 50% of households can be reached addressably, how much inventory is out there? I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask about Hulu in a second. But if it's only, I mean, DirecTV does not, they don't know all my ads for the hour. They own a tiny percentage. But how much actual inventory percent is probably addressable right now?
That's a great question. So I would say that right now, there's actually about 60 to 65 million households have some level of addressability through an STB box, right? Okay. Whether that's a linear feed or a VOD feed, right? So it's a little bit larger. But to your point, that's all being sold off of their 2 minutes per hour of advertising. So about 10%, there's about 20 minutes per hour, right? So about 10% of that is the MVPDs, or the local cable providers, have the sales rights to. So there's a scale issue from two places, right? The scale issue is that it's not truly national, because you only have 60% of the households that have addressability, right? So there's a whole swaths of areas that do not have this technology. And then two, you're really looking at a very small portion of the impressions that are addressable because of that 2 minutes of sales rights.
Now, how is that going to change, though? I mean, I would assume this is going to be growing.
Right. I think the one thing that we're missing here, and I think this is where, guys like Roku, Hulu, and all the OTT providers, right? That's a whole other level of addressability, right? Like, you could argue you could do household addressable plans, supplement what you can't get through the STV box, and do it through connected TV, right? So those impressions are growing all the time. I mean, we have, just in terms of time spent, not necessarily impressions, but already, if we think about premium long-form television, TV-like impressions or time spent, for 18 plus, it's already 10 to 15% of how people are watching television on the large screen, right? If you break that down to the younger demos, like adults 18 to 34, that jumps up to about 20 to 25% of the time spent is actually on a CTV device, right? So when you start thinking about the idea of using that, that access point for a different type of household addressable, right? Then I think those numbers become a lot bigger. What that number is, I don't know. Maybe someone else on the panel does, but it certainly can make it grow pretty quick.
Yeah, so in the last 18 months, Roku has seen the same amount of consumption on our TVs as we did in the first 9 years, the 9 years prior to that. So to put it in perspective, we're seeing a hockey stick effect of consumption that's taking place. The monetization of that consumption is an interesting thought. By channel, the rights, how the impressions are monetized drastically differs. So you do have the set-top box addressable model that is part of the channel. So maybe define channel. So Hulu is a channel, Pluto TV is a channel, the Roku channel is a channel. these are all channels that live on our TVs. And what we're seeing is that most of those channels have a variety of different rev splits that exist, revenue splits. And how that is monetized kind of varies by company. In terms of what that inventory split is, we ourselves see every single impression that runs on our TVs. And so having that kind of overall perspective allows us to, from an analytics perspective, see that volume of consumption and put it in perspective and really help our marketers gauge scale and gauge, as Jeff said before, gauge the opportunity to measure on the back end, because we can kind of ingest that from a targeting perspective and measure on the back end at a one-to-one TV level.
I would also offer that, think of, how do you define inventory today? Is it the 30-second ad, the 15-second ad? And if you think about what Roku is doing, if you think about what all of the tech companies are doing now, inventory now changes. So it's no longer a fixed 15-second, 30-second ad, because you're right, 10 years ago, it was a 2-minute window that DirecTV sold. 20 years ago, the cable companies were zoning their ads so that you could buy 34 different pieces of Chicago for location-based targetability, addressability in those terms. Now, all of a sudden, you look at the big companies non-media that are becoming media, such as the Amazons, the Googles. All of those companies are coming in and redefining what inventory could be. Why? Because now it's not necessarily a 30-second ad. It's a placement embedded in something that you've seen and now is measurable. So the inventory question is evolving very quickly, because exposure to content now can be measured with granularity. Couldn't do that with panels, can't do that with surveys. You have to do it with the technology of return path data that comes in, either from a set-top box, from a phone, from whatever. But now think of that world, because now it's not inventory. The companies are targeting the consumer. And where the consumer ends up on the screen and the content is now the measure, is the direction by which we are measuring that volume. It's the exposure, and then more importantly, the outcome. The last thing I'll say is that inventory now becomes defined with the consumption value. No longer is age, gender, men 18 to 54, the target. Why? Because you'll have younger people and older people that are still mixing in the same demographic. Doesn't make any sense. If you want to target the BMW owner, you can do that. Why? Because we've matched it to everybody who owns or leases a BMW. In the United States, we know exactly where they are. And more importantly, we know what their media habits are. We know that through privacy, but we can determine that. That inventory now says, is it a 30-second ad, or do we do something else? Do we have a BMW float across the screen in some kind of activity? That's an exciting piece of the business.
It is. Dylan, can I have you walk me through like an example? Like, say I'm Budweiser, and I say, hey, I want to, this sounds great. I'd love to target this very specific audience. I'm spend a lot of money on mass, but I want to go through you guys and walk me through like where they'd show up. How does that work?
Yeah, sure. So this is a fundamental value prop of Roku. We take that, so that marketer in that example there, we ingest that. We have our own DMP. We would ingest that audience segment into our DMP, and we have privacy compliant, essentially opted in audiences through our customer relationship. So a show of hands, who in here actually has a Roku? Fantastic. So when you purchased your Roku, when you activated your Roku, you likely activated that and signed in with a profile. Part of doing so enables personalized ads, personalized viewing experience recommendations, so on and so forth. So for the Budweiser example, what we're able to do is leverage that personal information, PII, and use that in a deterministic addressable way to build that Budweiser example audience segment. So with that client, what we would do is ask, of course, what that audience segment is. And with that audience segment, we'd be able to say with 100% certainty which Roku device we were targeting. So to Jeff's point a little bit ago, that one-to-one element that we so well appreciate in traditional digital, which is kind of an interesting term to say now, but desktop and mobile targeting being one-to-one connected TV, we can do the same thing now on our OTT devices. And we're doing that through the use of this deterministic data set and the relationship that we have with all of you in the room who have Rokus to be able to build that audience segment and then run that audience segment against the channels which are on our platform. And so that kind of leads into the second portion, which is supply. Clearly, supply is quite important. Nobody who's representing a brand wants to run on something that wouldn't be considered brand safe. And so at Roku, we take that quite seriously and personal. So we actually scrub our channel list to ensure that the channel list which we're running on, that Budweiser client would have full transparency into the channels that they'd be running on with that audience segment applied to that channel list. On the back end, maybe one of the very first questions we would have asked is, what is the KPI? What do you care about? Is it driving somebody to purchase a can of Budweiser? Is it driving brand awareness, brand affinity through a survey, which we can run on our TVs? That's how we would scope that solution for that client.
Okay. So one of the things I want to pick up something you put out earlier, and you don't have to answer this, but I'm just curious. One of the benefits of a lot of the digital platforms is that there's so much user-specific browsing data that just built a super rich profile. There isn't a way to capture that super rich behavioral data on a Roku or on a Xfinity box. So is it just third-party overlays?
So this is. I mean, maybe we could all kind of go through that. Certainly from a Roku perspective, we have automated content recognition data. So if you guys ever hear ACR data, that's automated content recognition, essentially acknowledging the picture that's on the screen and using that viewing data to personalize both the viewing experience, but from our marketing perspective, use that to create an ad experience as well. So that we have a large proportion of our TVs. So just a kind of a level set on Roku's value proposition. We're both a software, a hardware, and a content provider. So in that ACR example, we have our software built into 11 manufactured TVs, and those 11 manufactured TVs actually house our software. So I myself would have a TCL TV, and that TCL TV houses Roku software. And through that, that's how we have ACR data, viewing consumption data to leverage on behalf of our marketers.
From the consumer point of view, Comscore is the third-party measurement company, so full transparency. We don't collect any PI information, any personal information at all. We have no names and addresses, but the MVPD partners do. So what's important here is that we know the attributes of the households, but not directly from the MVPD because that would violate some of our covenants with them. However, every household in the United States is matched to 3 companies that know exactly who's in the home through census, through everything else. The question then becomes, if the MVPD goes through and does the matching process, which is what happens, it's identified through an ID number that's essentially privatized. So all the information is collected. It's not, in many cases, directly serviceable to a company like Comscore, but DirecTV knows. And there's opt-outs, there's opt-ins. So the information about the households are there. It's only a question of which party is accessing how through a PI process.
Can you close the loop? Like, is there enough data out there right now to say, hey, I'm advertising Jimmy Dean frozen breakfast sandwiches.
Yep.
You can tie back into offline data and close the loop for me. Or is it still panel-based, or is there?
No, it's, well, it can be or not. So it comes down to what do you want to accomplish? So for example, we at Comscore actually have worked with multiple agencies that have given us their CMR data on behalf of their advertiser. So we knew exactly, and we actually presented this at the RF as an example that I can talk about, Unilever. So Unilever had various shampoos. We knew the database of people who buy it. We know the households that bought it. We were then able to match it up to those households that watched specific events. We were able to control for it so that we could understand what sales lift was between households that were exposed to ads and households that were not exposed. It was not an addressable test. It was a targeting test to see how you could target consumers, not by virtue of an addressable system.
Okay.
It was really designed to understand how commercials work once you target the consumer, not through a specific area or device.
And that was because Unilever had good first-party data that you could leverage.
They had good party data, but also there were multiple data sets like Kantar Shopcom or others that actively have information about real purchasing. Yeah.
I mean, we do a lot of testing through Omnicom. We have a ton of clients who are actually sort of always on, like meaning they constantly have some sort of household addressable campaign in market. I think the verticals that are really seeing a lot of value here are going to be like the autos, for example. Polk data is actually pretty predictive about who's in market for a certain type of vehicle. So we have been able to show through either Polk or other sales data, you can look at sales lift, you can look at brand lift by partnering with guys like Miller Brown. Using first-party data is actually really fantastic if you can do it, because now you can start doing pre and post, and you can, the client can see whether there was a lift against those households because they have data that ties back to it through their CRM files. And then, of course, even location-based. We've done a couple tests where we work with like a ninth decimal or a ground truth or whoever who can say this household was exposed to this many ads and this person actually showed up to a certain location, right? So there's a lot of different ways to kind of close that loop. But again, I think everybody on this stage would agree that that's getting a little bit closer to sort of a last touch attribution. Like it's not the only thing that allowed that person to go in and take the action that we wanted them to. But certainly with household addressable, the good thing is that you can look at the control group versus the exposed group, and you can at least see what was the difference between the two. So you kind of parse it out a little bit, right?
One thing I'm wondering is, we're getting down to this household level, which is great. Are we going to be able to bring it to the individual level pretty soon? Is that much harder?
We have an interesting kind of pilot series that we have going right now, where we can acknowledge where the TV is in the home. That's something that we're testing right now. And part of doing so is acknowledging, where the TV exists in the household as a denominator for targeting at a deeper level.
Okay.
By definition, we're talking about a TV that we don't necessarily know who is sitting in that seat, of course. So what we do at Roku is normalize that data to acknowledge, since it's a household level targeting set, acknowledge the individuals that are normalized within that household. That's where it becomes probabilistic. Since we don't know if it's Dylan or his wife sitting on that couch, that is not necessarily going away anytime soon. But what we do is acknowledge that an exposure did take place on that television, and then tying it back. You asked a really interesting question before around using ACR data and tying that back, say, to Jimmy Dean. That is our bread and butter is taking that exposure at literally that watermarked creative and tying that back to a site traffic, or in the case of an auto, tying that back to foot traffic, and being able to competitive conquest and then retarget off of that. That's what we're doing, and at an individual level, certainly that exposure and conversion can take place at an individual device, but the exposure itself took place on the TV.
I think it's also a matter of expedience, but also privacy. So if you think about the data sets now that exist, and if you think about, let's say, purchase data, because ultimately that's now one of the key drivers of success. If you can really understand what the consumer is doing and understand what they're buying and using. And most of that information now is on a household basis. If you really think about credit card, if you think about the information that exists, it's household based. So that's the easiest thing, even though it's not easy, it's the easiest thing to solve for. And that's why I think it has moved quickly in the last 5 years, especially. Once you get into persons, then you have not only the detail and accuracy of who bought the product. So if you say cars, did the male 18 to 49 in the home buy the car? Did the wife, did the kid? You really don't know who did it. Who registered it doesn't really tell you. So the idea is, if you can get as close as that to understand what your propensity is, you're so much better than where you were a minute ago. And you don't risk the privacy issue, because anybody in your room, raise your hand and say if you would be willing to let information out about some specific products that you've bought in the last week, if you volunteer that. Now, you know what's happening, you know what's going on. Do you really want to expose what kind of toothpaste you buy or shampoo or any other products? And the answer is likely you'd think about it. So we're not trying to accelerate the privacy issue, because once you get certain levels, I think you're going to start arousing issues that you don't have to.
Okay. I don't want to get into privacy too much. We can take that for another day. I wanted to ask you, with all of these different places to buy addressable, I could go to Dish, Xfinity, 100 of those places, then I've got Roku, Hulu, and all these. Is it difficult executionally to put together a campaign around these things? So a client comes to you and asks this, like, how hard is it to execute on?
I think it used to be pretty hard, right? To cobble together, like if we're going to stick with household addressable, for example, you used to have to go and work with the top, 6 to 8 MSOs or your local cable providers and cobble them together. I think, both the marketers as well as the agencies have been working with the MVPDs to basically try to come up with a way of making this easier. And so what's happened is, you have AT&T Xandr, who is starting to rep for certain other MVPDs and their footprints. You have NCC, Comcast doing the same. So now I can buy about 80% of those households through two entities. The other thing that we've been doing on our end is actually working with the safe houses. So what do I mean by that? We were talking earlier about privacy rules and that the MVPDs are the ones who have the information. There's another layer there, which is the safe house, which would be guys like Axiom, Experian, Newstar, who are the ones doing the matching, right? So that nobody, right? And they do that, they mask the IDs. So everything's compliant with the privacy laws. But by centralizing the household matching through that entity, then we can say, I want you to match against every single MVPD footprint. So it's become a lot easier over the last few years to kind of put it all together.
Okay.
Yeah, what you are seeing that Matt's hitting on there is a consolidation. So right now, Roku makes up 27 million households, 65 million uniques total. And so what that works out to is essentially the second largest MVPD, multi-channel video program distributor, cable operator. And so when you look at Roku and you look at the likes of other MVPDs, you end up with only a few to make up that addressable household universe that we were chatting through earlier. And so through that consolidation and through the use of those DMP safe havens, you end up with a much more efficient workflow than you would have in years gone by.
Okay. Now, the answer to this next question, it'd be easy to say it depends, but give me I'm curious, how does the price of delivering, let's say, a 15-second spot on addressable TV compared to like a 15-second spot delivered on YouTube, video to video, like, are they comparable? How does that, give me a sense?
I mean, I think Matt would be
Yeah.
the best.
So you caught me with the YouTube thing. I thought you were going to go with the TV
Yeah.
thing. I will say
Have fun with
it has become very comparable to linear television, right? So, for example, you definitely pay a premium in CPM for this level of targeting. However, when you do the translation from what you're paying for broad demography to what it would be, what your CPM would be, your effective CPM would be against the intended target, you're usually well above $100, right? So when you do the math, it's actually not expensive. It's actually quite efficient. YouTube specifically, I'd say it's probably it's comparable to what we pay for Google preferred ads.
Okay. Now I've got one more question, and then we'll open it up for some questions from you guys. This might just be a rumor, but I had you guys here. I'm gonna ask you this. I heard that I can be watching like same show on Netflix as somebody else, but I can have different product placements in like Stranger Things in my house, and different product placement in Stranger Things in their house. Is that real? Or is that fake?
Definitely real.
Okay, that happens for real.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's the same basic technology is almost like just an ad, but they just ran two different things.
Yeah.
Well, it's same basic technology is a stretch. This is complex stuff. So think about digitalization of pixelization. Yes, it's the same basic technology, but it's
no. Tell me
it's
that. 'Cause
complex.
I don't really know. I have no idea. So how
No. It's what you're saying is it the same basic technology, but remember now that you can just, if you're looking at Photoshop, think of how quickly you can do that. Now there's mechanized processes and companies that are actually doing this so that different things are happening in different places, but it can be expensive because you have to figure out how many times you would like to do this. Because yes, you can do it, but then there's a cost issue associated with it.
Okay, so they're digitizing it post. They're not creating two different videos and streaming two different videos.
So maybe this is where, So what you're able to do is take different segments and create different interactive overlays on those different segments that essentially serve different interactive customized creatives. And that is done through the use of deterministic, or in other companies' case, probabilistic targeting. So we'll take deterministic, Dylan Moorhead TV and insert a certain interactive ad because I have a propensity for, maybe there's a weather condition that's going on I'm from New York City. Maybe there's some weather thing going on there. But in Chicago, an entirely different trigger for a brand that has maybe it's windier here, so there's maybe a windbreaker ad, Windy City. I don't know.
But I think it's fair to say it's not a prevalent practice yet, simply because of the cost of defining it that way.
Now, before I open it up to these folks, is there anything you wished I would have asked you that you're like, you didn't hit this one thing?
How much is the honorarium would be cool. That would be
Great.
I think you did a really good job. I think this is very interesting.
Well, thank you guys so much. We'll open up for questions now. Thank you. Right down here.
Hello? I guess it's working. So what is a skinny bundle and how does it fit into the whole ecosystem?
Sure, you want me to take it? So skinny bundles would be, we call them virtual MVPDs. So Dish Sling, for example. So Dish has their traditional linear TV households with an STV box in it. They've been in the market now for a few years with their OTT service, which is essentially live television, but through an OTT app. So that's what your skinny bundles are. You can also, some people are defining skinny bundles as you go back to your MVPD and say, I actually don't want all of these channels through my STV box. So some of them are selling sort of culled down in terms of how many channels you have on there. So I've heard that sort of defined two different ways, but that's essentially what they are. Now, once you go to the OTT-based or the digital-based delivery system, let's call it, of television, then again, that's where things become more automated, more audience-based. You can buy these programmatically, right? So there's a difference there.
Yes.
And
So,
an advertiser.
so
yeah.
much of it is built on carriage rights. So the cost per channel depends on what that publisher or that channel is actually negotiated with that virtual MVP, that cable operator. So the premise of skinny bundles is essentially around cost savings and personalization. So you can get a certain skinny bundle based on your affinity for certain channels, whereas maybe somebody else picks a different bundle, and they've both been more personalized based on the channels which you've chosen.
Think content and cost. So do you have cable or do you subscribe to a service right now? If I may. Do you? So if you look at your cable bill, I just did this because every year, if there's somebody from an MVPD, I negotiate with my MVPD every year to cut the costs down because you can have promotions left and right. So I just went through the process, realizing as I went through the bill that I'm paying $8 for sports packages, tax, and there's about $30 associated with all of that, which I then reduced a certain amount of content that I don't need anymore because I'm streaming various things. So the skinny bundle basically, I think, comes down to what content do you want? And then it becomes more of a boutique selection process, a la carte almost, but not quite, so that you can get the content for the right price according to what the competition is bringing. And it's a great time for consumers to do that.
How do you think that Disney's new offering is going to shift the current space that we have?
So it's further consolidating the landscape just by virtue of there's impacts on Hulu there, majority stake now. What it does is essentially say that there's another large content creation partner that is capable of creating distribution pipes. And then there's obviously ramifications from a monetization perspective after that.
Who do you think they're going after?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Hi, I hope this question's relevant for most people here. And I guess I need to explain myself. It's probably relevant to maybe B2B advertisers. I'm from Shaker Recruitment Marketing. So we do advertising that's employment related, basically direct response advertising to generate candidate flow to fill jobs and employment branding and all aspects of recruitment. So therefore, in targeting, what's important for us is skill set, job title, vocational information, as well as education. And you say we're doing that as far as laptops, tablets, phones. As far as going to, as you say, the large screen, will we be able to target that finite by occupational information?
Yes, you can actually do it right now. Because think of it this way, where if you believe what I said, that every household in the United States is identified by 3 companies, Experian, Axiom. If you think about that, part of the census definitions include everything that you just mentioned right now. And that information had been available for a long time, but I would say in segmented services. So you had traditional Simmons, MRI, or Scarborough. They all had those as part of their panel or respondent definitions. Now, because we have massive data sets, now because we have these PI matching services, we can identify just about every census break definition, which includes occupation, right now. The wonderful thing about that, and this goes back to your question about households, once you know the people in the households, now all of a sudden you can identify people in the households that conform to whatever your definition is. So that the likelihood and the availability of those persons in the household that meet the criteria can be targeted very, very efficiently right now.
And
One caveat to that is that what you have to be careful of is that the ID that you're buying against is actually their household and not their business.
Correct.
Right? And so that's something that we've worked with guys like, let's say, Dun & Bradstreet and others to try to figure out a better way of doing that. I don't know that it's perfect. I don't know. Maybe Jeff has an answer to
No,
that.
Matt, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what happens then, it becomes what's the program attribution to your target attribution so that you can relate the content more directly to that definition that you have.
So we'd have the option of, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but we could do basically, contextual components as well as behavioral
I couldn't hear you,
components.
sir.
Contextual, we could do
Yeah.
contextual.
Yeah.
These are content, programming content that's relevant to our
Yeah.
target, as well as behavioral.
Yeah.
All right. And then could we do IP targeting? So therefore, if let's say we know where the candidate is by street address, and we came to a vendor such as yourself and we said, okay, these are the households that we want to go to, can you target to that finite?
Again, with caution, because while the MVPD or any of the supplier knows the household, they're going to be very careful not to individualize it. They will group them and anonymize them so that you have protected them and yourself in the process. But your gain is incredible because it's going to key on exactly the definitions you described.
Thanks a lot.
So this question is for Matthew. How are you taking traditional linear TV clients and migrating them over? I mean, I'm assuming it's not, hey, give me your full 100% budget. Are you test and learn? It's kind of like, how do you change a tire where the car's moving?
Yeah, you must have been in all my meetings earlier today. It's not easy, and so we are. It's hard, right? We are asking both our clients and, quite frankly, our internal teams to fundamentally change the way they think about television targeting, right? And it's proving not to be easy. I do think that the stepping stone has been addressable television, right? So many of the accounts that have done a lot of testing with household addressable have started to see how that data can actually perform for them. It also teaches them what are the right data sets, right? I think the challenge for, let's say, major TV advertisers is a couple things. One, broad demography has worked for them for a very long time, right? Or at least it's perceived to have done very well. And they've built all their models, sales models, all of that off of these GRPs. So to ask them to move off of that in 1 year, I think is probably not the right thing to do. The way we've been approaching it has been basically saying, let's not walk away from the Nielsen GRP, but let's start looking at a secondary measurement, right? Let's try to keep your GRPs whole because we know that on a flow chart you have to hit that number, but let's plan more smarter against that intended audience while trying to keep those GRPs whole and, quite frankly, the cost of those GRPs whole, and slowly move them towards, get more comfortable with other data sets, right? So how do you move CPG from a GRP MRI based target to IRI data, for example, right? I don't know that you can do that in one fell swoop, but certainly I think showing them that we can do both, at least in the beginning, and make them more comfortable with these other data sets, I think is something that's, we're seeing ground being made up there. The other thing I would say is that I think digital as well, right? Like if they have high performing DMP segmentation, or if you're using IRI data and it's performing well for you in the digital space, having that conversation to say, hey, it probably will work pretty well for you, in the TV space, that seems to sometimes appease people in terms of making that big shift.
I would guess I would just add, Matt and I have spoken through this at length. Much of it is about proving the premise. So in order to suggest shifting anything, it's important that you have a reason to do so. And so one big piece that we focus on is using our data to answer that sort of question. So, providing reach insights. A lot of what we've spoken about is, might appear quite complex, but in reality, really, what we're saying is just a granular way of using the television, which is still a really strong reach driver. And so proving out the benefit of shifting investment that is comparable or equitable to where consumption is actually taking place is something that Roku, that's what we focus on. So, partnering with the market to kind of prove that shift out, because otherwise, then you're just kind of listening. You're not listening to the data. You're just listening to, kind of opinions.
Hi. So you actually answered my initial question about the addressable and how clients are looking to use it, whether it's all or nothing. And I agree with what you've said that it normally is a complement to what you're already doing traditionally. But have you come across, I guess this is more for Matthew, have you come across any clients that have gone 100% addressable, whether if it's both linear and via FEP OTT space?
That's a great question. I can't think of one that has, uh, well, we've had some clients who have gone more digital and cut their television budgets. Usually, either they don't have a big marketing budget or a big media budget, or or they have a very young target, right? So they're kind of doing very little in linear television, and in that case, they might be doing digital plus maybe some household addressable. But I would say that's not typical.
So, hey, Matt, Woody.
Hey, Woody.
So when does GRP, TRP die? And what does it get replaced with?
What? So
When
what
does-
was that?
When do GRPs
When does
die?
GRP or TRP die? When do we not care about it anymore? And what does it get replaced with?
Oh man. I think it's like the reality is that the GRP is the commodity, right? So all the buyers and sellers rely on the GRP. I don't know how easy or how quickly we're going to be able to move away from that. I think what it's going to take is to kind of take the conversation from earlier a little bit further is, you're going to have to prove out to them that there's other models that they can build that will basically tell, an auto person, an auto CMO to say, hey, it takes this many Polk GRPs to move this many cars off the lot. It takes this many, CPG GRPs or, IRI GRPs to move this many cans of this good off the shelves, right? So I don't know. What I think will happen more quickly, to be honest, is I think that we're going to be very surprised at how quickly people shift from linear TV viewing to IPTV viewership. And I think that will be the catalyst to force everyone to have to change. Right.
From a metric point of view, I would argue, it's not that I don't agree with your point, because I think impressions are going to dictate value, but just think of GRPs. What I think you mean is the rating point of a show. The question is, well, what's a rating point? It's nothing more than a percent. So I think percents are still going to be valuable. Why? As we open it up, half the homes in the United States have addressable, let's say, but a higher percentage of all of the cable homes or available homes, which brings it to maybe 70% of the MVPDs can do it. Percentages tell you something. Impressions, though, I think will ultimately become perhaps the currency value. But now the question becomes, impression of what? Because BMW says, if I can tell you that 40% of every BMW owner was exposed to content and had a lift of sales, now all of a sudden that changes the conversation. So I think if I parse it out, I think rating points for shows are relatively less important and will move to impressions, but impression based on consumer values is how I would say this thing is going.
Yeah, I think we're moving very quickly into a customized world, right? Where measurement becomes customized. So what does that mean? So every client will have different ways of measuring it. And if we want to call that a valued point, or it's all about, like you're saying, it's about the composition of the audience that you're buying, the percentage of the impressions that fall within that target, right? So I think every advertiser will have one or maybe several different types of GRPs that are specific to the data set and the audience that they're trying to buy.
This one's also for Matt.
come
Sorry
on,
to
guys.
Go, Matt.
bombard you here, but what are your thoughts on controlling for frequency within OTT and just cross screen in general?
Yeah, great question. So I think because of smart TV data, and because of digital sort of like the DT files, what you can get from data transfer files, we're getting closer to the idea of being able to look at cross-screen reach frequency, right? Like a true cross-screen reach frequency, by marrying those IDs together from the smart TV panel and from your digital log files, right? The challenge is that there are some black holes there, right? So think about the walled gardens, guys like Facebook, guys like Google, right? They're not passing those IDs in those DT files. I think once you get into device IDs versus cookie-based data, there's some challenges there as well. So I think there's a lot of progress being made, but it's certainly not perfected.
Question for you guys. You talked about measurement. How are you working with clients to show that deduplicated reach across all the multiple partners in the space, knowing that device IDs are going away, they don't all provide device IDs, and then even within the data sets that we do have available, there's some gaps based on whether it's a TCL TV or a Vizio TV or a Samsung TV in the household?
I think that's an excellent question. One that we tried to attack last year, and we did it in two ways. So what Comscore has done is developed two simultaneous cross-platform measurement platforms. One is CCR, which is Comscore Campaign Ratings, and the other is Extended TV. And both have different designs, but are actually coming together at the end of this year. Why is that important? Because what you're saying is, how do you deduplicate audiences? Because while we do want the impressions, we want to know what frequency is, but does anybody in the room disagree that the reach across screens for those consumers is maybe the most ultimate metric that you need to get? That's what we heard loud and clear from actually some of folks in the room here. So what we did is build a system that said, if we through the course of massive, and I mean massive data sets, where we are collecting digital information from every type of screen, that's supplemented by a panel that's connected to our device graphs, we can really start to understand what those relationships are and how reach is actually produced. So we're in beta with both of those products right now to actually answer that question, both from a campaign and then from a total environmental perspective. Because if we don't address that, and if we don't understand that as an industry, we're really not going to be successful.
I guess I would just build on that too. We look at it, looking at our overall universe, 50% of our, or over 50% of our universe is our cord cutters. And so what incremental reach from our perspective is, where is an audience that you can no longer reach through linear TV pipes, and providing measurement services, incremental reach studies, and so on and so forth that offer reach insights in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that this is where the Nielsen-based reach frequencies start breaking down, right? And the reason why is because if you're trying to do that against an advanced audience, you can't really marry that to the relatively small, and I'm being, very nice here, the small panel that you have from Nielsen. It just is not statistically valid to do so. So that's where the power of this smart TV data and STV data comes in. But now you're starting to look at, your reach and frequencies, and where is all that frequency coming from, and what can I do about it? That's coming from your intended target. But just know that when you start looking at broad demography, you're using that at a household level, right? Because these IDs are really at that level in many cases, right? Specifically the TV side of it, right? So you're kind of almost making that part of it obsolete. In the near term, what you need to do is you need to start looking at both and say, okay, what is the more advanced data sets telling me in terms of reach frequency? And then what am I seeing when I pull my RFs from Nielsen? And you're gonna have to kind of, sort of marry the two, right? But I think, again, going back to, Woody's original question, like you start to see how this broad demography Nielsen-based measurement starts to break down as we move.
All right, well then, since I got the mic again, let me pile onto that. So therefore, if impression becomes the metric upon which we buy things, when, I'm going to use my dead analogy again, when does the upfronts die? Because that impression is no longer unique by that specific point in time.
Hey,
And then new fronts, which is kind of a joke.
Yeah, you go.
The reason, just at the recent ARF in New York, this actually came up. And, I can tell you with fact that for the last 20 years of my career, we've asked that same question, when are the upfronts going to die? And they, in fact, are only expanding, because if you think about it, there's the normal upfronts, then there's the outfronts. Every time you turn around, there's it's a gravitation to the mean, meaning, okay, how do you sell as much as you can, as quickly as you can from a seller point of view? From a buying side, you may have a different opinion, but that's where deals are done longer term. I think they're not going away anytime soon, simply because there is a marketplace that naturally wants to aggregate as much revenue and get the deals done as quickly as possible. It's getting more complicated, but I don't foresee it. I think it's going to expand.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think the other thing that we have to take in consideration is that you have major brands who want access to the best inventory at the best price, right? And that's what essentially agencies are set up to do. And I just don't see that going away, right? We're always going to have really premium inventory, and we're going to have not so very premium inventory, right? And so the way to lock in the best stuff is to do that during a sales period that happens in May through July.
I guess I would just add that really what might change is the transaction type. So finding those efficiencies, but then having flexibility in how a transaction actually occurs. So I obviously work on the programmatic side. We support our direct IO business, with an emphasis. And so giving our clients the capacity to operate in an upfront model, but flexibility to transact in a variety of ways through programmatic guarantee deals, through non-guarantee PMPs. It's that type of flexibility still going through an upfront model that we're seeing.
So then that gives us as media buyers the leverage, because if upfront, biggest thing is upfront goes away, big holding companies lose leverage to buy in bulk. So is that how we then address it, is in a programmatic reserved inventory perspective against a given audience?
So maybe a nice way to put it is especially when you use advanced TV for much of the reason that we're talking about it, for efficiency and targeting purposes, what you've defined in doing so is a smaller pool of supply, because all of a sudden you're going after woodies, and that's great because it's targeted and it can be measured on the back end and so on and so forth. But in doing so, really you're defining a very small pool of supply, and so how do you scale that out is really important, of course. So having that balance and having a pool of supply that you've already kind of pre-tapped into, and then can cut up based on audience segments, based on supply partners, based on platforms like ours, where you can really use that to your benefit, is a component to think through.
Yeah, and when you think about it, Woody, I don't know that it changes that much. I just think that you'll have a lot more variables, right? So if you think about it, when we go in as Omnicom and we register budgets in the upfront, we're doing that across all of our advertisers who are in the market for upfront buying. But all of those marketers have different, even broad demos, right? But we're going in and registered budgets at an impression level, right? So I think what will change is, one, how you execute against that upfront, right? More and more of that's going to become what we're calling programmatic guaranteed pipes, right? And then two, you'll just have a lot more ways of divvying up those impressions against different audiences.
So I don't know if this is a variation on the when will something die question or an extension, but given all of this, do you guys anticipate changes in how creative television content is produced and created, and in particular, how TV advertising is created, given all of this?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why, because we had to figure out how to measure the new world. So when you think about inventory, as we were talking about before, and you had asked about how content is going to change, think of how product placements can be utilized. And we have a business, and in fact, we have Kristen over here, if you'd like to talk about what we're doing, in that space. But when you think about that inventory and you think about how advertising is going to change, and now you think about how digitalization is matching, you can make anything do anything anymore. So now think of advertising where you're not breaking away from the content and you don't mind it. So early examples, for example, when Walking Dead, if I may, when it was in its heyday in its first year or two, they made a great point of integrating ads into the content. Not just the 30 or 60-second ads, but they were having the cast drive around in Hyundais at the time. You kind of wonder, wait a minute, you're escaping the zombie apocalypse in a Hyundai and there's nothing in the trunk but it's dusty. So you think about that and wow, that's a great form of advertising. Then I went in and took a look to see whether or not Hyundai indexed well against Hyundai, and it didn't. You know what did? What vehicle do you think, if you're escaping the zombie horde coming after you, what vehicle would you want to escape in? Jeep. Who said Jeep? Jeep. So that's where the integration comes in, because you can now technically do a lot more creative things than you've ever done. But now, will it work is the question, and that's where the data come in. So I see a really terrific world where you don't have to worry about commercials or what we've studied, which is ad avoidance, which can be huge depending on the content. There is no ad avoidance if it's product placements done well, but now we can measure it with outcomes. That's how I would think a lot of things are going to develop.
Sure. Yeah, so we are able to, there's a couple interesting techniques. When you look at the pipes being the way they're set up, where we can quite literally serve to a specific TV, what you're able to do is do creative versioning and creative sequencing. So you can literally set up, like an A/B test of two different audience segments, test their propensity to, view-through rates, conversion rates on the back end that are associated with those two creatives, and then optimize based on creative conversion rates. So that's kind of one of the, I guess, fundamental points of what makes advanced TV so fascinating, specifically connected TV, since it's a real-time ad serving technology associated to it. We're able to optimize based on creative when you break out those two and start essentially measuring performance associated with each.
At Omnicom, we have an actual unit that, within there that does what we call programmatic creative. And essentially, you're going all the way down to even color palettes, right? Like how are people responding to different colors and all of that, different products for different people. And I would say the interesting thing is that now with the growth of connected TV, you can now do this on the largest screen as well, right? It's not just those smaller digital screens anymore. Pretty exciting.